On a cold night in December of 1999, the people of a small New England town gathered in their church for a rare midnight sermon. The event itself was unusual. Pastor Elijah Moore, a man known for his quiet steadiness, rarely called services at such an hour. But that night, the pews filled anyway. Families brought blankets, elderly parishioners sat wrapped in coats, and the sound of hymnals echoed faintly against the stone walls. Elijah had stood at the pulpit many times before, but those who were there would later recall something different about him that night. His voice trembled, not with sickness or age, but with something unsettled, as if the weight of what he was about to say was too heavy for him to carry. When the clock struck 12 and the church bells rang out across the sleeping town, Elijah paused in the middle of his sermon. The sound filled the sanctuary, and many remembered watching his hands grip the pulpit tighter than usual, his knuckles pale in the candlelight. Then, without explanation, he stepped away. He walked toward the side corridor leading to the sacristy, the small chamber behind the altar, and vanished from sight. At first, no one thought much of it. A pastor stepping away during a service could mean anything, retrieving a book, preparing the Eucharist, or taking a moment of prayer. But minutes stretched into longer silence, and whispers began to move through the congregation. People shifted uneasily in their pews. A few of the deacons rose and made their way toward the door where Elijah had gone, expecting to find him preparing quietly in the back. But the chamber was empty. The door to the outside was locked from within, the small windows shut tight. When they returned to the sanctuary, their expressions unsettled. The atmosphere shifted from reverence to confusion. Parishioners searched the rest of the building. They checked the offices, the storage rooms, even the basement furnace space. Elijah was gone. By the time the final pews emptied, the stillness of the church carried more dread than faith. The police were called in the early hours of the morning. They swept through the church with flashlights, moving carefully across wooden floors that had been walked for generations. Every exit was intact, every lock unbroken. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no blood, no overturned furniture to suggest a struggle. Even Elijah's car remained parked outside in its usual space, keys and wallet still sitting in his office. His unfinished sermon notes were left open on the pulpit, words that no one would ever hear completed. As dawn broke over the town, the reality set in. A man had vanished inside a building where dozens of witnesses swore they had seen him just minutes before. No one had seen him leave, no one had heard a cry for help, and yet Elijah Moore was simply gone. For a congregation that had come seeking comfort and faith, all that was left behind was silence in a place that should have been safe. And in that silence, questions began to take root, questions that would haunt the town for the next 24 years. By morning, the entire town knew that Pastor Elijah Moore was gone. News traveled quickly in a place where most people shared pews on Sunday, where families had trusted Elijah to bury their dead, marry their children, and guide them through hardship. For 2 decades, he had been their anchor, the one voice that never wavered when tragedy struck. Now, without warning, he had vanished in the middle of a sermon. It felt less like a disappearance, and more like the ground had been pulled out from under them. The first few days were filled with panic. Parishioners returned to the church, retracing their steps, insisting there must be some explanation. Some clung to hope that Elijah had gone into retreat, perhaps overcome by stress or illness. Others whispered far darker theories, careful not to say them too loud. In kitchens and on front porches, they asked questions they weren't ready to face. Had he run from some secret debt? Had someone silenced him for what he knew? Or, as some of the most superstitious claimed, had the church itself swallowed him? Police worked around the clock in those first weeks. They treated the case like an abduction, scouring the woods surrounding the town for any sign of him. Volunteers carried lanterns and dogs combed the underbrush, their calls echoing into the night. Officers drained a nearby pond after locals insisted they had seen unusual ripples on the surface, but nothing was found beneath the dark water. Interviews stretched late into the evenings as detectives tried to piece together a timeline, but it was always the same story. Elijah had walked into the corridor and never come out. Forensic teams searched the church again and again. They inspected the sacristy, the crawl spaces, even climbed the ladder to the bell tower. Dust was disturbed, cobwebs torn, but there was no evidence to prove a man had been hidden or carried away. They found no blood, no torn fabric, no footprints leading away from the building. The church remained as it always had been, locked tight from the inside, yet missing the man who had stood at its pulpit only moments before. The town's grief slowly hardened into division. Some parishioners clung to Elijah's reputation, insisting that whatever happened had been against his will. They argued that no man so devoted, no pastor who had given his life to the church, would ever abandon his congregation. But others began to doubt. They pointed to his pale face that night, to the tremor in his voice, to rumors of growing tensions with the church board. They asked whether Elijah might have carried secrets no one else had seen. Suspicion turned inward, and neighbors who once prayed together began accusing each other in hushed tones. The congregation that had once been united by Elijah's sermons began to fracture. Families quietly left the church, unwilling to sit in pews where his absence stared them in the face. A few refused to attend altogether, claiming the building carried a curse. Even those who stayed admitted it was hard to pray beneath the rafters where their pastor had last been seen alive. Faith had always been the thing that bound the community, but now it was the very place where their trust had unraveled. In the months that followed, law enforcement had no leads to offer. The case, despite its urgency, stalled. Every search ended in silence. Every theory met with dead ends. By the end of the year, the headlines shifted away, and the town was left with little more than speculation and loss. Where there had once been certainty, there was now only rumor. Rumors that would linger for years, growing darker each time the mystery was retold. And beneath those rumors, the same haunting question remained. How could a man vanish from a locked church with a full congregation watching, leaving behind nothing but silence? Detectives arrived before dawn, their boots echoing against the wooden floorboards as they entered the church where the pastor had last been seen. Their first task was to secure the building, to determine whether Elijah Moore had left on his own or whether someone had forced him out. Every door was checked, every window examined, nothing was broken, nothing had been tampered with. The locks were intact, the glass undisturbed. It was as if the building had sealed him in, but he was nowhere to be found. They began with the pulpit. Elijah's notes still lay open where he had been preaching, half a page of scribbled handwriting left unfinished. To investigators, it looked like a man interrupted mid-thought, his pen resting at the edge of the paper. In his office, they found his wallet, his car keys, even a coat folded neatly on the chair. If he had intended to leave, he had left everything behind. That absence of preparation only deepened suspicion. Fingerprints were lifted from doorknobs, hymnals, and stair railings. Every mark matched those who had been inside the church that night, mostly parishioners who had already given statements. No unknown prints surfaced, no trace of a stranger hiding among them. Detectives interviewed the last people to see Elijah, focusing on the moment he stepped away. One woman recalled that his face seemed pale, almost strained, as though he carried a burden he could not voice. Another described how his hands trembled slightly when he turned the page of his notes, but no one had heard him cry out. No one had seen anyone follow him into the side corridor. The search extended into the hidden spaces of the church. Officers crawled beneath the floorboards, checked the basement, and climbed the narrow ladder to the bell tower. Dust covered their uniforms as they searched every corner, every crawl space, and still there was nothing. They even brought in dogs who sniffed through the pews and sacristy, but the animals found no fresh trail beyond the church walls. The trail stopped cold inside. In the absence of physical evidence, detectives began to question motive. Could Elijah have staged his own disappearance? The idea unsettled the congregation, but investigators couldn't rule it out. Men who vanish without a trace often leave behind debts, affairs, or private despair. Detectives dug into his records, looking for overdue bills, undisclosed loans, or a hidden double life. But Elijah's accounts were clean, his name unconnected to scandal. His family described him as steady, if sometimes quiet. His colleagues said he was devoted to his work, never known to walk away from a responsibility. If it wasn't voluntary, the possibility of abduction loomed larger. Yet nothing supported it. No footprints outside the church, no tire tracks suggesting a hurried getaway, no signs of a struggle inside. How could someone remove a man from a locked building without leaving so much as a scuff on the floor? Days turned into weeks, and the lack of progress wore on both investigators and the town. Detectives were forced to admit what parishioners already feared. Elijah had simply vanished. They classified the case as a probable abduction, but acknowledged privately that no evidence pointed in any clear direction. For a case with dozens of witnesses and a single location, the silence was staggering. In the official report, the final entry from that night was blunt. A pastor, mid-sermon, walked into the sacristy and never came out. His car remained in the lot. His wallet and coat remained on his desk. His sermon notes, incomplete, remained on the pulpit. What didn't remain was Elijah Moore. The unanswered question, whether he walked away of his own accord or was taken against his will, hung over the town like a weight. And though detectives had no suspect, no weapon, no body, the investigation carved a deeper divide. Had their pastor been a victim, or had he chosen to vanish? Neither answer would bring comfort, and both left the same haunting absence in the pews where his voice had once filled the room. In the absence of answers, speculation filled the void. As weeks turned to months and then into years, the disappearance of Pastor Elijah Moore became less of an investigation and more of a story that the town carried with it, shaping it, haunting it. With no evidence to anchor them, people began to create their own explanations. Some insisted that Elijah had been silenced for reasons that went far beyond the church walls. They whispered that he had discovered something, about a member of his congregation, about money, about sins kept hidden in plain sight. In those versions, Elijah's disappearance wasn't just a crime, but a deliberate act to keep him quiet. Other voices took a darker turn, claiming the church itself was tainted. The way he vanished during a sermon, with no exit and no trace, seemed unnatural. Stories spread about old burial grounds beneath the church, about shadows in the bell tower, about the bells ringing on their own long after midnight. For some, it became easier to believe in curses than in human malice, because at least a curse explained why a man could simply disappear without leaving the faintest mark behind. Detectives tried to keep the case grounded in reality, but even they found themselves chasing leads that dissolved under scrutiny. A janitor who had worked at the church briefly came under suspicion. His past carried a criminal record, minor thefts, disorderly conduct, and he was the kind of man easy to point to when fear needed a target. He was questioned, his alibis checked, his history pulled apart. But nothing placed him near the church that night, and no evidence connected him to Elijah. The town's suspicion eventually shifted elsewhere. But the damage had been done. The janitor left town, unable to live under the shadow of blame. Attention soon turned inward to the congregation itself. Whispers of tension between Elijah and Deacon Samuel Wright gained momentum. Samuel was wealthy, influential, a man who had donated heavily to the church and often wielded his financial support like authority. Parishioners recalled arguments between the two men behind closed doors, heated exchanges about money and the direction of the church. Some said Elijah wanted greater transparency, while others hinted he had threatened to expose something Samuel was hiding. Yet when detectives pressed Samuel, he stood firm, providing polished answers and a carefully maintained alibi. There was no physical evidence, no witness who saw the two men together that night. Without proof, suspicion could go no further. As the years stretched on, the rumors only grew more elaborate. Some claimed Elijah had left willingly, choosing freedom from a life of responsibility and expectation. Others insisted he had been taken by someone who knew the church well enough to hide him forever. Still others clung to supernatural explanations, saying that no earthly crime could account for such an impossible disappearance. With each retelling, the story shifted, becoming less about what was known and more about what people feared to believe. By the 5th anniversary of his disappearance, the official investigation had grown cold. Detectives had moved on to other cases, new tragedies demanding their time. Files were boxed up, evidence sealed away, and Elijah's name slipped into the long list of unresolved cases that never found their answers. Yet in the town, the wound remained open. For those who had known him, who had trusted him, The silence was unbearable. They wanted closure, but the truth was nowhere to be found. And so the church stood, half empty now, a monument to unanswered questions. The pews carried fewer voices. The sermons delivered by successors could not erase the memory of the man who had vanished before their eyes. His absence was not just a mystery, it was a reminder of how fragile their faith and their community had become. Each theory, each suspicion, revealed more about the people who stayed behind than about the man who was gone. Still, the question refused to fade. If Pastor Elijah Moore did not leave by choice, then someone had made sure he would never be found. And if that was true, it meant that someone who once sat in those pews, someone who had sung the hymns and bowed their head in prayer, had carried a secret darker than anyone dared to imagine. For Elijah's family, the days after his disappearance were not only filled with shock, but with a suffocating silence that stretched into years. His wife, Margaret, had been in the front pew that night, holding her youngest daughter's hand as she watched her husband step away from the pulpit. She had been the first to sense something was wrong when he didn't return. At first, she waited with the patience of a woman who had always trusted him, convinced he would walk back through the side door at any moment. But as the hours passed and dawn came without him, her life fractured into before and after. In the early months, Margaret clung to faith as her only anchor. She told reporters, neighbors, and even the police that Elijah would never have left them willingly. She repeated it in every interview, her voice trembling but unyielding, a mixture of defiance and grief. She insisted he was taken, that he was a victim, not a deserter. Yet even as she spoke, she could see the doubts in people's eyes. The absence of evidence allowed every whisper to spread unchecked, and those whispers quickly grew cruel. Some suggested he had run off with another woman, leaving behind a family and congregation too heavy to carry. Others believed he had cracked under the pressure of leadership and walked into the night, abandoning everything he once claimed to hold sacred. Margaret lived with the constant sting of hearing her husband spoken of as a coward. Their eldest son, Daniel, took the disappearance the hardest. Only 16 at the time, he felt the betrayal sharper than anyone else. He refused to accept the explanations his mother clung to, instead convincing himself that his father had abandoned them out of choice. In the years that followed, Daniel grew increasingly rebellious. He rejected the church, stopped attending services altogether, and lashed out whenever Elijah's name was spoken in the house. To him, faith had become a hollow word, and the man who had taught him to live by it was nothing more than proof of its failure. The younger children were quieter in their grief, but the confusion showed in their questions, questions Margaret could not answer, questions about why their father never came home. The family became isolated as the years passed, though some parishioners supported them, offering meals, prayers, and sympathy. The undercurrent of suspicion never went away. Every trip to the grocery store or walk through town carried with it the weight of stares and whispered judgments. People asked if Margaret truly believed Elijah hadn't left her. They asked whether she had noticed strange behavior at home or whether she had ignored the signs. Even after 10 years, the same question surfaced, reopening wounds that had never closed. By the time the case reached its 10th anniversary, the Moore family could no longer bear the town's scrutiny. Margaret made the difficult decision to leave, packing up what little remained of Elijah's presence in their home and moving her children several towns away. She said publicly that she was doing it for their peace, that they needed space to live without the shadow of constant suspicion. Privately, it was also an act of survival. She could not raise her children in a place where their father's name had become a ghost story. Even after leaving, the past followed them. Margaret continued to speak about Elijah when asked, her words always the same. He had been taken against his will. Her voice carried both unbroken loyalty and quiet despair, a woman who could never let go but also could never heal. For her children, the mystery became a wall they could not climb. Daniel, by his 20s, spoke openly of his belief that Elijah had chosen to vanish, and his anger hardened into distance from his mother's faith. The others learned to live without speaking his name at all. For the town, Elijah's family became another reminder of what had been lost. For the family, the town itself became a reminder of what had been taken. In the end, the grief that bound them together also pushed them apart. And though they left the place where it all began, the wound traveled with them, an absence they carried in silence, just as heavy 20 years later as it had been the night he stepped away from the pulpit and never returned. As the years stretched on without answers, the case of Pastor Elijah Moore shifted from active investigation to whispered legend. The church where he vanished stood at the center of it all, looming over the town like a monument to the unanswered. Its bell tower, once a source of pride and a gathering call for worship, became a place of unease. By day, it was simply a tall, weathered spire, its rope dangling in the nave for anyone to see. But by night, the tower became the subject of stories no one could quite prove, yet no one could completely dismiss. Teenagers, restless and curious, turned the tower into a test of courage. Some dared each other to climb the narrow wooden stairs that spiraled up to the bells, to linger in the dim loft where the air smelled of dust and age. They claimed they heard footsteps above them when no one was there, the creak of boards shifting under invisible weight. Others swore they heard muffled cries, faint and desperate, echoing near the bell rope as though someone were trapped between the floors. On more than one occasion, a group of kids fled in panic, insisting the heavy bells had swayed on their own. The ropes tugged without a hand. The stories spread quickly through town. Parents scolded their children for sneaking into the abandoned sanctuary, but secretly, many admitted they felt the same chill when passing the church after dark. A few claimed to have heard the bells ring in the middle of the night, slow and uneven, when the church stood empty and the doors had long been locked. Whether it was the wind or something else, no one could say. But the rumors gained a life of their own. These tales, however exaggerated, kept Elijah's disappearance alive in the minds of the community. Every whisper about the tower circled back to him. To the night he stepped into the sacristy and was never seen again. Some wondered if his presence lingered there, bound to the place where his life had ended. Others scoffed, saying it was nothing more than kids feeding on the town's grief, turning tragedy into entertainment. But even those who dismissed the legends admitted the church no longer felt like a place of sanctuary. Attendance dwindled. Where once the pews had been filled with song and prayer, only a fraction of the congregation remained. Families who had sat together for generations stopped coming. They could not reconcile worship with the unanswered question that hung over the sanctuary. The silence inside the building on Sundays grew louder than the hymns ever had. The few who remained tried to carry on, but every empty pew reminded them of the man who had vanished and the community that had slowly fractured in his absence. The church board struggled to keep the doors open. Repairs went undone, paint peeled, and the once proud building slipped into disrepair. Without the life of its congregation, the structure itself began to mirror the weight of its mystery. The bell tower, in particular, became a symbol of fear more than faith. Parents warned their children not to climb it. Older residents avoided looking up at its shadow when they walked by. Yet still, it drew people in, a place that seemed to promise answers but never delivered them. In time, the rumors around the bell tower became more than just stories. They became the way the town carried Elijah's absence, the only language they had left to explain what had happened to him. And though most dismissed the tales as folklore, deep down, everyone knew the truth. A man had disappeared within those walls, and no matter how many times they searched, no matter how many years passed, no one could explain how. It was a silence that refused to die, and it left the town waiting, wondering if the truth still lingered somewhere inside the church, perhaps in the very tower where the bells, on certain nights, seemed to toll for no one at all. By the late 2010s, the church that had once been the heart of the town stood silent, its doors chained shut and its windows boarded against the elements. Years of dwindling attendance, coupled with the stain of Elijah Moore's disappearance, had drained it of life. What had once been a sanctuary now sat as a hollow shell, the roof sagging, the bell tower leaning like a weary sentinel over the empty streets. Locals passed it without stopping, unwilling to look too long at the building that had become more monument than place of worship. Its silhouette carried with it the memory of a night that had never been explained, a reminder of a pastor who had vanished in plain sight and of the fracture that had followed. Inside, the decay was worse. When the last services had ended, hymnals were left behind on pews that now sagged under the weight of damp. Mold crept up the plaster walls, and water stains spread across ceilings once painted white. Rats had taken over the basement, their nests hidden in the insulation. The air was heavy, filled with the smell of rot and dust that settled over everything like a second skin. For years, the building had been untouched, its locks rusting, its rooms collapsing inward on themselves. It was no longer a church, not truly. It was a place frozen in time, waiting. In 2023, after decades of abandonment, the property was purchased by a developer. Plans were drawn up to restore the church, to repurpose it as a community hall, a place for weddings and concerts rather than sermons. For the first time in nearly 20 years, workers pried the boards from the doors and stepped into the stale air inside. What they found was a building eaten alive by neglect. Wooden beams in the rafters had rotted through, sections of the roof had caved in, scattering debris across the sanctuary. The bell tower, though still standing, leaned under the weight of weather and time, its ladders barely safe to climb. The restoration would require weeks of cleanup before any rebuilding could begin. The work started with cataloging the damage. Mold was scraped from the walls, broken glass cleared from the floor, piles of ruined hymnals hauled out by the box. Each day, more of the church's decay was laid bare. Workers climbed the narrow staircase of the bell tower, their flashlights sweeping across the beams and rafters. Dust swirled in the light, and the air grew thinner the higher they climbed. What had once been the most sacred point of the building was now a danger zone, its wooden planks warped, its support beams splintering under pressure. During one of those routine inspections, a worker paused at the base of the tower. The floorboards near the entrance sagged oddly, as though hiding a hollow beneath them. Pulling back layers of insulation and splintered wood, he uncovered something unexpected, an opening that had been sealed over long ago. Behind it, tucked into the space where the walls of the tower met the foundation, was a cavity that none of the blueprints had marked. It was small, just large enough for a man to crouch inside, its walls lined with dust and crumbling mortar. But within that hidden void, something caught the beam of his flashlight. At first, it looked like debris, scattered wood, fabric long since decayed. But as the dust cleared, the shape became unmistakable. A rib cage curled in on itself, a skull resting against the corner of the wall. Clothing, now little more than threads, clung to the fragile outline of bones. It was human. The site was shut down immediately, the police called to seal the tower and preserve the find. For the workers, it was a moment of shock, the sudden realization that the very building they were repairing held more than just history. It held a body. And for the town, word of the discovery spread like fire. After 24 years of rumors, suspicions, and whispered stories about the bell tower, something had finally been found inside it. The question was no longer whether Elijah Moore had vanished willingly or unwillingly. The question was whether these remains, hidden inside the walls of the church all this time, belonged to the pastor who had walked away from his pulpit on a winter night and never returned. And if they did, then someone had not only taken his life, but had hidden him in the one place no one had thought to look, leaving the truth to sit in silence above the congregation for nearly a quarter of a century. When the first call reached the police station, it was delivered with a mix of disbelief and urgency. Workers clearing the rot at the base of the old church tower had stumbled upon bones, not just fragments, but a nearly complete skeleton folded into a hidden cavity no one knew existed. Officers arrived quickly, sealing off the property with tape, their vehicles lining the street as curious neighbors gathered at a distance. For a town that had carried a mystery for almost a quarter of a century, the moment was heavy. Something long buried, literally, was being forced back into the light. The cavity at the base of the bell tower was cramped, a narrow void between structural supports, shielded by old insulation and rotting boards. The remains lay curled, the skull resting against stone, ribs collapsed inward with the pressure of time. What little clothing clung to the bones had long disintegrated into colorless threads, but enough fragments remained to suggest a clerical shirt, once black, now brittle with decay. Alongside the body were traces of personal effects, unidentifiable at first glance, eaten away by moisture and dust. The discovery was chilling not only for what it revealed, but for what it implied. The body had been there the entire time, hidden in the very building where search teams, police dogs, and investigators had scoured every corner all those years ago. Forensic teams arrived within hours, donning protective suits and carefully cataloging the site. Each bone was photographed in place, then removed with painstaking care. Early analysis confirmed what the eye already suggested. The remains belonged to an adult male, dead for more than 20 years. The decay matched the timeline of Pastor Elijah Moore's disappearance almost perfectly. Still, science demanded proof, and dental records were pulled from old archives. Within days, the comparison confirmed what the town already suspected. The remains were indeed Elijah's. After 24 years of rumor and speculation, his body had been found, not in some distant field or anonymous grave, but inside the very tower that had loomed over his absence. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. Families who had once attended his midnight sermon, children now grown with families of their own, struggled to process that he had been in the church all along. Older residents recalled the endless searches, the sleepless nights, the candlelight vigils, all of it conducted under the shadow of the tower that had been holding the truth. Even detectives who had worked the original case admitted their disbelief. How could an entire investigation, with manpower and resources, have missed a body hidden within the structure itself? As word spread beyond the town, reporters descended, eager to cover the return of a decades-old mystery. Interviews aired with former parishioners who recalled Elijah's pale face that final night, his voice breaking mid-sermon before he stepped into the sacristy. They spoke of the fear that had haunted the congregation, of the fractures it caused, of the families who left the church believing their pastor had abandoned them. Now, those wounds reopened, mixed with anger at the thought that closure might have been possible years earlier if the search had gone deeper. The discovery raised new questions that the remains themselves could not yet answer. How had Elijah ended up in that crawl space? Had he hidden there willingly? Or had he been placed there by someone else? Was his death the result of a tragic accident, or was it the outcome of violence carefully concealed? The bones told little at first, but investigators knew that modern forensic technology might offer details the original detectives had never been able to access. Scans and examinations were ordered, hoping to determine cause of death. Meanwhile, townspeople returned to stand outside the church, gazing up at the tower with fresh unease. For years, stories had spread about footsteps on the stairs, muffled cries near the bell rope, and bells that rang on their own. Now, those tales seemed less like folklore and more like echoes of something that had been hidden all along. What had been a ghost story for restless teenagers was suddenly a crime scene, and the realization was chilling. The official word from police was cautious. They confirmed the identity of the remains, but said the investigation was ongoing, pending forensic analysis. To the town, however, the discovery reignited not just old grief, but old suspicions. Theories long dismissed began to resurface. If Elijah had been hidden inside the church, someone had put him there. And if someone had put him there, it meant that after all these years, the case was not just one of disappearance, but of murder. For the first time in decades, there was hope that the truth might finally come out. The body had been found, but the story of how it ended up in the tower and who was responsible was only just beginning to unravel. The discovery of Elijah Moore's remains forced detectives to reopen the files that had gathered dust for more than 2 decades. Boxes of evidence were pulled from storage, the old case notes re-examined line by line. What had once been written off as an unsolvable disappearance was now, undeniably, a homicide. Forensic specialists studied the bones recovered from the tower, focusing on the skull. The damage was clear and precise: blunt force trauma, a crushing blow delivered with enough strength to kill instantly or leave the victim incapacitated. This was not the mark of a fall, nor the accidental strike of a collapsing beam. It was deliberate, targeted, and violent. Elijah Moore had not slipped into that crawl space. He had been placed there after being struck down. Attention turned to the architecture of the church itself. Investigators studied blueprints dating back to its original construction in the early 1900s. It was here they discovered what the workers had stumbled upon: a concealed crawl space at the base of the tower, walled off during renovations in the 1950s and long forgotten. It was never part of the active search areas in 1999 because no one knew it existed, not even the search teams who had torn through every accessible inch of the building. Whoever hid Elijah there had knowledge of the church's structure, or at least the awareness that such a void could keep him hidden for years. The implications sent a shock through the town. This was no stranger breaking in under the cover of night. The person responsible had to have been someone who knew the church, someone trusted enough to be near Elijah that evening. It was not a random act. It was personal. Detectives returned to old witness statements from that night, scrutinizing them with fresh perspective. The woman who had described Elijah's pale face, the deacons who claimed to search the sacristy. The accounts that seemed consistent until placed against the new evidence of murder. Forensic analysis offered more. Fragments of fibers were recovered from what remained of Elijah's clothing, fibers that didn't match his own garments. Under magnification, they appeared to be wool, consistent with the type used in heavy coats or church vestments of the time. The fibers, preserved in the sheltered crawl space, were a tangible clue pointing toward contact with another individual. Combined with the skull fracture, the conclusion was undeniable. Elijah had been assaulted, likely in or near the sacristy, and then dragged or carried into the crawl space of the tower. The emotional weight of the findings rippled across the community. For years, many had clung to the hope that Elijah might have walked away, that his absence had been a choice, however painful. That illusion was shattered. He had not left his family, nor abandoned his congregation. He had been murdered inside the church he served, hidden in its walls, while those who loved him searched endlessly for answers. The betrayal of that truth cut deeper than the disappearance itself. Detectives now faced the most pressing question. Who had the motive and opportunity to commit such an act? Theories that once seemed like idle gossip gained new gravity. The long-standing tension between Elijah and Deacon Samuel Wright was revisited. Their disputes over finances and the direction of the church had been well documented, with several witnesses recalling heated arguments in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Back then, suspicion had been little more than rumor. Now, with a body recovered inside the very building where those arguments had taken place, the possibility of Samuel's involvement could no longer be ignored. Still, police knew they needed more than speculation. They examined the fracture on Elijah's skull in detail, comparing the pattern of the injury to potential weapons that might have been present in the church. The force appeared consistent with a heavy object swung at close range, perhaps a candlestick, a tool, or even part of the building's maintenance equipment. The exact weapon was missing, but the wound spoke clearly. This had been no accident. For the families who had carried grief for decades, the findings reopened wounds. Margaret Moore, Elijah's widow, was both devastated and vindicated. She had always insisted her husband had been taken against his will, and now science had proven her right. But vindication brought no peace. The realization that someone in their trusted circle had likely killed him and hidden the body where his congregation would unknowingly worship for years afterward was a cruelty too heavy to accept. The town, once again, found itself staring at the bell tower with unease. What had been rumor was now fact. Elijah's death had been concealed in the church itself, and someone had lived with that knowledge in silence. The community began to whisper again, not with folklore this time, but with suspicion, as every old name and every detail from that night was dragged back into the open. Detectives, armed with modern forensic tools and a clearer understanding of what had taken place, prepared to follow the trail of evidence wherever it led. And as they did, one name rose more sharply than the rest, tied to inconsistencies in testimony and a history of conflict with Elijah Moore, a name that would finally bring the truth into focus.